Welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. Today we're going to be discussing how the media picks up certain missing persons cases, and on the other hand, in other cases, they leave and buried in the other headlines of the day. Why does this occur, and what is the reason for it? That's what we're going to be discussing throughout this episode. So I hope you tune in and watch and enjoy. We're going to get into it. When I sit down and I really think about what I call the media filter, I realize that it isn't just a conversation about headlines or news cycles. It's a conversation about power perception and whose stories are allowed to matter in the public eye. Because every single day, people go missing across this country, and families are thrown into unimaginable situations, and communities are left searching for answers. But only a small fraction of those cases ever break through to national awareness, and only a handful become the stories that dominate the timelines or lead the broadcast and spark widespread attention. And the question I keep coming back to is the one I can't ignore. Why does this occur? Why does one case become a household name while another fades just as quickly? Why do some families receive an outpouring of national support while others are left fighting just to be heard? From my perspective, the answer is simple, but it's also not accidental. It's a result of a system that filters the information before it ever reaches us. It's a system shaped by media priorities and audience behavior and deeply rooted patterns that influence what gets amplified and what gets overlooked. When a case first enters the media space, it doesn't arrive on equal footing with every other story. It gets evaluated and is sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. It's all based on a number of factors. Is there a compelling footage? Is there a clear narrative? Does it fit into the format that the audience will immediately engage with? Can it hold the attention in a fast moving news cycle where every second counts? And if that answer to those questions isn't strong enough, the story risks being pushed aside before it ever has a chance to grow. And that's where the imbalance begins, because the stories that do get picked up, the ones that are repeated and reinforced, start to take on life of their own. They become more than just reports, they become ongoing narratives. Updates follow, interviews are conducted, and experts weigh in on social media. The social media also picks it up, and suddenly the story isn't just being told, it's being amplified from every direction. That amplification creates an awareness, and that awareness creates action because the people sharing the tips start coming in, and pressure builds, and that pressure can make a real difference in how a case unfolds. But on the other side of that, there are stories that never get the chance. Stories that are just as urgent, just as deserving of the attention, but that don't meet the same criteria or the visibility. Maybe there isn't enough footage. Maybe the details aren't too unclear, and maybe it doesn't fit into a narrative that's easily digestible. And because of that, it does get less coverage, less repetition, and less visibility. And without that visibility, it ultimately becomes incredibly difficult for the case to gain momentum. Now, what makes this even more complicated is the role that all play in this process, because the media filter doesn't just operate from the top down; it responds to us, to the audience. It responds to what's clicked on, what we watch, what we share, and what we engage with. Every time a story gains traction online, it sends a signal that this is what people want to see more of, and the media outlets competing for the attention in a crowded space naturally lean to the signal. They prioritize what performs well. They amplify what keeps people watching. So in a way, the filter is consistently being reinforced. It's shaped not just by editorial decisions, but by collective behavior. And that's where the conversations become uncomfortable, because it means this isn't just about the media as some distant entity. It's about a system that includes all of us. It's about recognizing that attention has become a form of currency, and where they choose to spread that attention has real world consequences. Because the attention drives awareness and awareness drives action, and when the case doesn't receive that attention, it doesn't just stay small. It risks being forgotten. Leads go cold, public interest fades, and families are left carrying the weight of what the silence is trying to keep their loved one story alive in a space that has already moved on. Now, we deal with this every single day, news cycles day in and day out. It might go for 2 or 3 days and then it goes cold, or it stops being talked about and brought to the attention of the public. But I think what it must feel like watching other cases receive wall-to-wall coverage while yours struggles to get a single follow-up, knowing that visibility could make a difference, but not having access to it. That's not just frustrating, it's heartbreaking, and it raises a deeper question about fairness, about whether the system we rely on to inform us is truly serving everyone equally. Now, to be fair, not every decision made in the newsroom is driven by bias or intent. There are real constraints, time, resources, competition, and the constant pressures to produce content that resonates. But even when those decisions are made with practicality in mind, the outcome can still create a pattern of unequal coverage. And when the pattern repeats over and over again, it stops looking like coincidences and it starts looking like something we need to examine more closely. Because over time, this selective visibility shapes how we understand the world. It influences which stories we remember and which cases we talk about, and which ones we never ever hear about in the first place. Now, this creates a kind of hierarchy, not of importance, but of the attention, and that hierarchy can have lasting effects, not just for the individual, but on the broader conversation about justice and accountability. And when there's the role of the storytelling itself, because the way the story is told matters just as much as whether it is told at all. The case that gains traction are often presented in ways that create immediate emotional connection. They are framed with detail, with imagery, and with a sense of urgency that draws people in. And once that connection is made, it's easier for the story to spread. But when a case is presented without the same level of depth, when it reduced to a brief summary or a passing mention, it doesn't have the same impact and it doesn't create the emotional hook. And without that connection, it's a much harder cause for people to engage with it, to remember it, or to feel compelled to act on it. So what we end up with is a system where the visibility isn't just about what happened, it's about how effectively that story can be told and shared. And what raises important questions about what we value, about whether we prioritizing stories based on their significance or their ability to capture the audience's attention, because those aren't always the same thing. And that's where I believe we have to start shifting the conversation, not by pointing fingers, but by becoming more aware of how the system operates, by recognizing that the stories we most often are not necessarily the only stories that matter. They're just ones that made it through the filter. And once you see that, it's hard to unsee. You also start to notice the gaps, the stories that aren't being followed up on, the cases that disappear from the coverage without resolution, and the names that never become widely known. And you begin to understand that every case that captures national attention, there are many more that don't. So the question becomes, what do we do with that awareness? For me, it starts with being intentional, with choosing to look beyond the headlines that are already everywhere and seeking out the stories that haven't been given the same platform. It means supporting efforts that aim to bring visibility to overlooked cases And it means recognizing that attention is powerful and using it in a way that is thoughtful and inclusive. And I've been thinking and contemplating a lot more about that, and I want to bring that to my videos as well. I want to start covering cases that you don't really hear about in the headlines, that maybe you wouldn't otherwise hear about unless somebody brought it up. So that's something to look forward to as well. I can start doing some videos on stories that ain't well known or maybe you've never heard of that's happening in this world. Let me know what you guys think. Always leave a comment if you want me to look up something or to cover something that you may want covered. I have no problem with that, and I appreciate any feedback I receive. But as I bring this all together, I want to keep going here. So as I bring this all together, I want to keep coming back to one critical idea, that the media filter is a real. It shapes what we see and what we know and what we respond to. And while it may not be entirely avoidable, it is something we can become more conscious of. Because awareness creates the opportunity for change, and if we're willing to question what we're shown, to look beyond what is immediately visible, and to give the attention to the stories that haven't yet broken through, then maybe, just maybe, we can start to balance the scales, even in a small way. Because no story should have to fight for the right to be seen, and no family should have to wonder why the story wasn't enough. That's reality of the media filter. And yes, I keep pulling on the thread that I start to realize something even more unsettling. The media filter doesn't just decide what we see in the moment, it quietly shapes how history is remembered. Because years after, now, when people look back at this time, they won't see every missing persons case. They'll see the ones that made the headlines. And for instance, obviously, there's one that I've been covering, Nancy Guthrie case. That would be an example of a high coverage situation that has been in the headlines, although it has tapered off here recently. She's been missing for over 54 days and continuing, and we're not really getting much from the authorities at this point. So a lot of people are tuning out and not really keeping focus on any breaking news or anything like that. But we're going to move forward. They'll remember the names that were repeated and the stories that were amplified in the cases that were turned into documentaries or specials or ongoing conversations that are trending on Twitter or elsewhere. Ones that never went viral, that never get the second or third follow-up story, those cases risk being erased, not just from the news cycles, but from a collective memory, which we all could understand. The less coverage, the less visible it is to people, and the less people know. But that's where the weight of it really starts to settle in for me, because now we're not just talking about media coverage. We're talking about the legacy. We're talking about which stories are preserved and which ones quietly disappear over time. And when that visibility determines the memory and the memory influence our accountability, you start to see how deep this really goes. Because if a case isn't remembered, if it never becomes part of the larger narrative, then the urgency around it fades. The pressure fades, and when the pressure fades, so does the likelihood of the resolution of the case. You know, I also think about how quickly the news cycles moves, especially today. The stories come and go at a pace that's almost impossible to keep up with. And something that dominates headlines one week can be completely overwhelmed the next. And in the kind of environment that we live in, only the most amplified stories manage to hold on. Only the cases that continue to generate the attention and are able to stay in the conversation. Everything else gets pushed further and further aside or replaced by the next headline, the next story, the next moment competing for the attention. And this creates a kind of survival of the loudest, where the cases that makes the most noise are the ones that endure. But the noise isn't always a reflection of the importance of the situation. It's often a reflection of how well a story fits into the system that amplifies it. And that's a crucial distinction because it means that silence isn't an indicator of a lesser urgency. It's often just a result of not making it through the filter. So then I start asking myself, what does fairness look like in a system like this? Is it even possible to create equal visibility in a space that's driven by attention, engagement, and constant competition? Or is the goal something different? Maybe it's not about making every story equally visible all the time, but about making sure no story is completely invisible. About ensuring that even the cases that don't go viral, that they still have a pathways to the awareness, to still have opportunities to be heard, and still have a chance to reach people who can help you. Because right now, the gap between visibility and invisibility is too wide, and that gap has real consequences. I think about the emotional toll on the families who are caught in the gap, families who are watching coverage of other cases, seeing the attention and the resources at the public's response, and wondering why their loved one's story hasn't received the same. That kind of comparison isn't about jealousy. It's about a desperation. It's about knowing that visibility can make a difference and feeling like that opportunity was denied to you. And that's why this conversation matters, because once you understand that the system isn't neutral, once you see that there's a filter shaping what gets through, you can just look at the media coverage the same way anymore. You can't look at it the same way. It's impossible. You start to question it. You start to look at what's missing and not just what's present. And that shift is perspective, which is powerful because it changes how you engage. It changes how you pay attention to it. It changes what you choose to share instead of only reacting to what already is in front of you. You start to seek what isn't being shown, and you start to recognize the awareness doesn't have to be passive. It can be intentional. And that shift in perspective is powerful because it changes how you engage, and it changes what you pay attention to. It changes what you choose to share instead of only reacting to what's already in front of you. You start to seek out what isn't being shown, and you start to recognize the awareness doesn't have to be passive. It can be intentional. And that's where I think real impact begins, not in trying to overhaul the entire system overnight, but in small, consistent shifts in how to approach information, and being willing to go beyond the surface and understanding that just because something isn't widely covered doesn't mean it isn't important. Because if enough people start making the shift, and if enough people start looking beyond the filter, it creates pressure in a different direction. It creates demand for broader coverage, and it signals that people care not just for about the biggest stories, but about the overlooked ones too. And over time, that kind of demand can influence how stories are selected, how they presented, and how long they stay in the conversation. But it starts with awareness. It starts with recognizing that what we see is not a full picture, that there are always more stories and more cases, and also more voices that haven't been given the same level of attention. And once you accept that, it becomes harder to ignore the imbalance. So as I continue this conversation, I keep coming back to the idea that visibility is not just about exposure. It's about the opportunity for answers, the opportunity for accountability, and the opportunity for closure. And when the opportunity is unevenly distributed, it creates a system where outcomes can be uneven too. And that's not something we should be comfortable with. At the end of the day, every missing person case represents a life interrupted, a family searching a story that deserves to be told, and whether the story reaches millions of people or just a handful, it shouldn't determine how serious it's taken. So the real challenge, as I see it, is learning how to see beyond the filter without becoming overwhelmed by it, to stay informed without becoming desensitized, and to remain aware of the losing focus, because this isn't about consuming everyday stories. It's about understanding that every story exists, whether we see it or not. And that understanding changes everything. It changes how we define importance, it changes how measures impact, and it changes how we will respond to the world around us. Because once you realize that the media filters is shaping more than just headlines, and once you see that it shapes perception, memory, and even outcomes, you can't go back to seeing things the same way. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the goal isn't to eliminate the filter entirely. That may not even be possible, but the goal can be to make it visible, to bring awareness to it and to question it, and to make more international or intentional choices within it. When something goes from being visible to or invisible to visible, it loses some of its power. And right now that media filter holds a lot of power. The question is, what are we going to do with that knowledge? I want to thank you once again for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens Podcast. I just wanted to give you something to think about, so reflect on what we just read today, and I would love to hear what you have to say about it. Thank you, and have a good day. Peace.